Welcome to another episode of Fear the Old Lore, where we look at the Japanese and English version of FromSoft games to gain a better understanding of the lore. This episode will be a little different from some of the other ones that we've done in the past. So rather than a more polished video, we'll be looking at a little infographic that I made for the potential timeline for Bloodborne, and I'll give a more stream of consciousness train of thought as we go through this video. So, the very first portion of this timeline will begin way before the events of the game really start. That's actually kind of where most of the lore takes place. And so once we actually get down to the beginning of the game, I just kind of have it trail off because it'll end up speaking for itself after like Gascoigne transforms and everything. So starting from the beginning, we'll say that the Pthumerians discovered the blood, and opinions about how they discovered the blood or the source of the blood may differ. So we'll just kind of say a blanket statement that they discovered it. And my opinion is they would have refined the blood that they got over generations, and once they funneled enough blood to their blood queen, they named themselves a monarch, which was traditionally named Queen Yharnam, and eventually they created a royal capital called Pthumerian Isle. So, with that being said, there is a little bit of ambiguity in the times of when Ais and the Lauren civilizations existed. They could have potentially existed at the same time before Pthumerian Isle. They could have come later. We don't really know for sure. And with that being said, it is also a bit of a mystery as to when the Nightmare Frontier came into existence. So when I do have question marks on some of these passages here, it's more of a rough guideline or more of a guesstimate as to where they existed. So going into the actual format of the timeline itself, I do have kind of continuous segments. Like this middle section right here is kind of like the main pillar of time, and everything else is just like trying to branch off of it. So from Queen Yharnam, we can posit that they came up with the name of the city of Yharnam, since the city is most likely named after the Pthumerian monarchs. And then from that point on, the Pthumerians probably had their descendants form Cainhurst later on. So that's kind of where the timeline from the ancient time of the game connects into the events which precede the main game. So eventually the Chalice dungeons did get sealed off. The Pthumerians kind of died out, or at least they went dormant. And so there is like a little bit of a time gap between the Chalice and Pthumerians and the Byrgenwerth scholars existing and exploring the tombs. So another quick note is this timeline isn't to scale, because that would just be a nightmare trying to fit, and then also scrolling through everything. So take this as a very, very rough guide of the events of the game. So in Byrgenwerth, we had the scholars of archaeology and history, and we don't know exactly how long the school has existed. It's not terribly important. The real big kicker for what started off the events of Bloodborne was the scholars of Byrgenwerth came into contact with the Augur of Ebrightus, and from that, it's what launched their inquiry into the cosmos itself, which is why they went down into the labyrinths right there. And so from this time period, I would say Byrgenwerth had their own kind of tomb prospectors, not necessarily like healing church affiliated, because this would have been the before times. And Gehrman may have been one of them. That makes the most sense to me. He was probably like their hired muscle to get past all of the monsters down in the tombs. So, with that being said, once they got into the tombs, they came into contact with the arcane or the eldritch truth, depending on how you want to look at it. I talked about this more in my previous videos, but all instances of eldritch truth, eldritch wisdom, etc. are synonymous with the term that they use for the arcane stat. So that's why I just have they came into contact with the arcane, which ties into the next point, is that the scholars of Byrgenwerth use sedatives to counter the effects of the arcane, which caused people to become frenzied. And in the Japanese text for the sedative, it said it's what led to the establishment of blood healing. So using sedatives to counteract the effects of frenzy led to their discovery of blood and blood healing. And so that kind of gets tied into Gehrman doing his thing. And so going back to like the encounter with the arcane, we don't know exactly what it was. It could have been like the voice of Ebrightus, maybe from the Augur of Ebrightus, or there was just something that happened in the tombs that caused Doris and the Gatekeeper at the very least to go mad. And so beneath that, I do have Willem gains the Eye Rune. And sorry for the dogs growling in the background. That's kind of the nature of the stream of consciousness format. So the reason I do have Willem gains the eye rune right here and a question mark is there's a little bit of a translational ambiguity that doesn't get carried over into the English, and that Doris and the gatekeeper could have been literally accompanying or following Willem and not just obeying his orders. So it's possible all three of them and or maybe Ram were all in the chalice when they came into contact with something, which gave like Ram eyes on the inside and Willem the eye rune. So with that being said, there is the possibility that Ram didn't really gain eyes on the inside from Kos, or maybe she did, so it's questionable how much we can rely on Mikulash's dialogue, but it is also possible that Ram could have been discovered later, so I do have question marks surrounding Ram. And so this blue branching timeline right here kind of just represents Ram's existence throughout the chalices, and then eventually coming into the main game, and it's really just kind of all a mystery, so that's just supposed to represent her continuity. So going back to Byrgenwerth with Doris and the Gatekeeper, so this blue line right here kind of still represents Byrgenwerth on the timeline. And then after they established blood healing, blood led to the discovery of the undesired beasts, and that kind of relates to Carol and the Carol runes. So the beast rune was the first rune discovered. I figured that probably happened fairly early in the timeline. And with that being said, I guess I should probably move the whole eye rune thing even further below the Carol, because I would have come after the beast rune according to the Japanese description there. So I should probably revise that now that I'm looking at it. So, alright, I'll just leave this here for now and fix it later and update things. Alright, so going back to like the main timeline, Gehrman did his stuff for Byrgenwerth, and according to cut content, so you don't have to believe this, but just for the sake of continuity, I think it could still be relevant to how we understand the retail version of the game, or it could just still be cut entirely. Willem said to Lawrence in one of the earliest dialogue lines that still has voiceovers, and I might just play that here and splice it in later.
You think now as Gehrman did to betray me?
So Gehrman was the person who betrayed Willem before Lawrence, and he would have taken the blood most likely to Cainhurst if we believe Alfred and his claims about the Vile Bloods. And so from there, we do say that the Cainhurst Vile Bloods were born, and I'll leave the question of like whether the Hunter's Workshop is established later. One thing that I do want to talk about is we get Maria coming into the picture. She was one of Gehrman's first students, and I think that still ties in together fairly well of potentially Gehrman taking blood to Cainhurst first. Alright, so one of the other things that's worth considering with Alfred's dialogue about the inhuman Vile Bloods, it's that he said it was a scholar of Byrgenwerth, which allegedly took the blood to Cainhurst, which isn't a big deal, but I do find it interesting because it would suggest that it could have even happened before the Healing Church was established. So I'll just take that as a little bit of food for thought, I suppose. So essentially, the Knights and Vile Bloods of Cainhurst could have had the blood before the Healing Church even existed, is kind of what I'm getting at, which kind of goes into this version of the timeline that I have written down here. So the Cainhurst Vile Bloods were born, and because of that, it does call into question when the Hunter's Workshop was established, because we do get Maria, and it says like she used hunting weapons, and she might have had her weapons and whatnot crafted before the workshop was established, which is why there's this question mark, because her set is described as having been created in Cainhurst. After that, Byrgenwerth likely discovered Mother Kos, and there could have been the raid on the hamlet, and depending on where we look at this timeline, Gehrman betraying Willem could have coincided with the raid on the hamlet and the Curse of Kos, so this stuff could be kind of all smushed together, and it just wouldn't really fit together super well in terms of like the events of the timeline. So this stuff all like right here is fairly compacted, perhaps. We don't really know. It's just my best guesstimate for what we have. Okay, so Gehrman and Maria and potentially others associated with Byrgenwerth conducted the raid on the hamlet. They encountered the corpse of Mother Kos, potentially abducting the Orphan of Kos in the real world and causing the Great One, Mother Kos, to curse all of those who would take the blood. So I'll just leave that for now, and then sometime after the events of the Hamlet, Maria abandoned her kind of a hunter-style duties and would eventually join Lawrence in the Healing Church if the Nightmare Research Hall is anything to believe. So, going back to the whole Rom thing, even though we do have like the questions over here, I guess I should put this lower now. We have like the questions over here of when Rom came into the picture. If we do believe Mikolash in saying that Rom gained eyes on the inside from Mother Kos, that would potentially happen before the raid on the Hamlet or like during it. So just keep that in mind. After that, there is a kind of most likely a break in the timeline between the events of Byrgenwerth and the actual establishment of the Healing Church. So from here I say Lawrence must have left the Byrgenwerth at some time to give the second kind of betrayal against Willem, and then that's when he established the Healing Church. And from here we have no idea how much time elapses, how long the Healing Church existed before Lawrence turned into a beast, before he and Gehrman summoned the Moon Presence. It could have happened before, but between that timeline, I do believe that the Hunter's Workshop would have existed before the Healing Church, because there was kind of the old hunters before Ludwig, and they would have probably dealt with beasthood or other kinds of monsters. And so the doll was likely created in that absence of after when Maria left, and yeah. So when the Healing Church was first established, we did have the old hunters, so there was a little bit of time before Ludwig created the Healing Church Workshop and they had their church hunters. So going back to this timeline, the Healing Church was established, and eventually Lawrence and Gehrman most likely summoned the Moon Presence. And one of the questions that brings up is, does that have any ties to like the lecture hall? Because we do have a few notes in the lecture hall which seem to have a little bit of extra knowledge about the potential events of this happening, since like the nameless Moon Presence beckoned by Lawrence and his associates. And so perhaps the lecture hall got teleported then. I don't necessarily believe it, but I guess it's a possibility, so that's why I have it in a question mark. And since the school of Mensis and Mikolash like wear the school uniform of Byrgenwerth, it does suggest that they probably existed very early on in the timeline, maybe before the Healing Church had like official uniforms. So maybe that's how like that was meant to fit together. But an unknown period of time elapses, and then Lawrence dies, potentially killed by Brador and whatnot, depending on your accepted fan theory. And so there's another period of time where there's a break, and then the Healing Church had their unofficial tomb prospectors go down into the tombs, which most likely led to like Ludwig finding like the Holy Moonlight Sword. So they probably didn't have like official hunters at that point, and they were just probably still exploring the chalices where they discovered the blood originally. So after the Healing Church was established, they also probably experimented on blood administration and grooming blood saints so they can keep administering blood to people. This likely led to the establishment of the Research Hall, which we see some of that in the Hunter's Nightmare. The Research Hall most likely led to the orphanage, and from the orphanage we would later get the choir and explore eyes. So we'll come back to that in a little bit. So going back to Ludwig, he is established as the first Healing Church hunter, and I believe he's a tomb prospector for multiple reasons. I think the shawl on his back is reminiscent of the tomb prospector shawl. I think the Holy Moonlight Sword is most likely a Pthumerian relic of some sort. So he establishes the Healing Church Workshop as the Healing Church's first hunter, and then from there he starts to recruit Yharnamites for like hunting militias. And so one of the interesting things is the Yharnam hunter set mentions Ludwig recruited people from the masses essentially, but it's not a Healing Church item according to like the storage system. So that's an interesting discrepancy. And part of the reason I'm bringing this up is some people think that Ludwig may have been an executioner because of the shawl, or that the tomb prospectors and all of the other healing church factions or hunters and whatnot came after the executioners because of the English line where it's like all healing or church attire was based on the executioner set essentially. But that's just kind of a misunderstanding of the English. And not to say like the English is super cut and dry about it, but what the English is trying to get at is later on all healing church attire was inspired by the executioner attire, but it's not saying that literally all healing church attire came from the executioner attire. It's all later healing church attire. So that's a little bit clearer in the Japanese, but still possible to get to that understanding in English, but I think it's less likely overall. According to Gehrman, the first hunters in the time of Ludwig were protected by the blood ministers of the healing church, but now in like the modern times they've forgotten all about that, so that's why I have the ministers protect hunters. And so throughout all this time, we had the old hunters at first, then the church hunters come in. Gehrman's workshop was still a thing for a little bit, but then it eventually becomes disused, and we don't exactly know how or why it comes to that. Maybe it's because like the style of hunting beasts changed because they became bigger and Gehrman's techniques weren't as relevant anymore. But throughout all that time, with Gehrman potentially bringing the blood to Cainhurst, we do know that they had their own blood hunters and that they would hunt hunters. And if the ministers were protecting hunters and the blood hunters were hunting them, they likely led to a kind of conflict, which to me would most likely coincide with the executioners conducting the raid on Cainhurst. Going to this section of the timeline, with like the raid on Cainhurst and Old Yharnam, I'm not entirely sure on the order of events, and we don't get anything concrete in the game to give us an estimate of whether or not the raid on Cainhurst happened first or the burning of Old Yharnam happened first. So I discussed this quite a bit with some of the members on the Discord about which came first. What do you think? Like, what evidence do we have? So I do want to be very clear, this is inconclusive, and this is more based on inference than anything. So I think the raid on Cainhurst may have come first, if for no other reason than the healing church of today doesn't really recognize the forbidden blood of Cainhurst and the vile bloods, and they seem to be fallen out of like living memory, with the exception of like Alfred kind of knowing the history of Logarius and all that stuff. So Alfred's role as an executioner is questionable. I don't really want to get into that right here though, but maybe he's just kind of a poser or like a history buff. And part of my reason for saying that, like, he doesn't really use full-on executioner weapons until you actually send him to Cainhurst. He uses the Kirkhammer beforehand. Why wasn't he part of the raid? All this kind of stuff to consider. So going back to like the Healing Church workshop, eventually other forms of workshops started to sprout. There was the Oto workshop, which is affiliated with the Healing Church workshop according to the storage system, with the piercing rifle, which is kind of interesting. And so there's a period of time where the Oto workshop existed, and then they gave rise to the powder kegs, which are described as the workshop heretics. So they could just be heretics of the Healing Church, maybe the heretics of like Gehrman's workshop. It's not entirely clear. However, the powder kegs items are not Healing Church affiliated, which leads me to believe that they're heretics of the Healing Church. And that might have come about as a result of the burning of Old Yharnam. So, going back to the executioners briefly and towards the choir, because the executioners' heavy shawl did design later church attire, that leads me to believe they would have potentially inspired the choir's uniforms design, as well as maybe even like the black church hunter set and the white church hunter set. We don't know that for sure, so one thing I do want to bring up back in relation to the uniforms is the Madman set is described as like Healing Church tomb prospectors, but they don't have shawls. The Arhagul hunter set doesn't have shawls. So I don't think like literally all uniforms were inspired by the executioners. I think it's more likely the later ones. And the choir one is no doubt in my mind directly influenced by the executioner set. The choir came after the executioners most likely, and once they got the Great Eyes Chalice, they started to explore eyes, And I don't really know when this happened. All of this stuff with the choir could have happened after the burning of Old Yharnam and the raid on Cainhurst. This stuff right here is just really rough, so forgive that. And so there might have been that period of time in between the raid on Cainhurst and the burning of Old Yharnam. Part of me has wondered if both events actually happened on the same night. If so, that'd be kind of a fun way to describe like why the Healing Church would have abandoned Old Yharnam. Maybe they were all elsewhere fighting in Cainhurst. Another potential fun idea that I've had is the blood moon could cause people to become frenzied. Like, we see Adela attack Ariana for jealousy. Maybe something happened to make the executioners turn on Cainhurst. I don't fully believe that, because I don't really think they just had like a bunch of executioners chilling in Cainhurst. Maybe they had a bunch of invitations, who knows, but yeah, I just wanted to mention that. Alright, so after a period of time, the Oto workshop did form into the powder kegs, and that they were kind of present in the burning of Old Yharnam, which was influenced by the blood moon, which does call into question Ram's existence if she was like hiding the blood moon, and it appears over Old Yharnam. So I'll just leave that alone for now. And one of the interesting things about the powder kegs is that they do seem to supply some weapons to the League. So the League may have existed sometime before the burning of Old Yharnam, and they might have just gotten the weapons later, or whatnot. But the connection between the powder kegs and the League is kind of interesting to me, because Walter uses the whirligig saw, he's known by it. And so within the League, we have the old Hunter Henrik as a verified member. You can summon him as a League summon, and that does call into question whether or not Gascoigne was a League member. Gascoigne does say that he did depart from the Healing Church, so maybe he joined the League later, but we don't really get any information about him other than he was Henrik's partner. So I think it's a plausible connection there. And from there, they kind of go to the events of the main game. So this is kind of like where the timeline splits. So once the burning of Old Yharnam happened, they used most likely workshop hunters, because we get the Charred Hunter set, which is described as coming from the workshop and all that kind of thing. So it is possible the burning of Old Yharnam did happen before Cainhurst, but Jura's existence there makes it a bit more curious, especially when we go back to the whole, like, nobody has the living memory of the Cainhurst stuff, but a lot more people seem to remember Old Yharnam based on, like, the item descriptions. So that's kind of why I think of the two, the burning of Old Yharnam is more likely to come after the raid on Cainhurst, but again, it's not clear. So going back to the burning of Old Yharnam with the blood moon and everything, it does call into question like the school of Mensis's role throughout things. So I did have them potentially at the very beginning of the Healing Church timeline. We don't really have much information as to what they were doing at all. They eventually did control Yahar Ghul, and they might be connected to the teleportation of the lecture hall later on. So they most likely summoned the blood moon of Old Yharnam. What the goal of that was is a little bit of a mystery. I've wondered in previous versions of the game whether the blood moon was when they first obtained Murgo, but that doesn't really pan out. A lot of people believed that the blood moon of Old Yharnam would have happened when Lawrence and Gehrman potentially summoned the moon presence, but unfortunately that really doesn't pan out, if for no other reason then we know that the powder kegs, which happened way later in the timeline here, existed during the burning of Old Yharnam, because they're the ones that cleaned it up. And part of the reason why we know that for a fact is the powder kegs existed as heretics of the workshop. So there's this Oto workshop which would have existed before them, and even before the Oto workshop we had the Healing Church workshop, which got established by Ludwig. So there's potentially 3 workshops that would have existed after the Healing Church was established. I realize you might be able to argue that Lawrence and company could have summoned the moon presence way later, but I don't really think that works out, because Ludwig is described as the first Healing Church hunter. So to me, that's a capital H dreaming hunter. I think Ludwig was in the dream, and so he was buffed by the moon presence and the doll and whatnot, because Gehrman talks about him. So that's what makes the most sense to me. Alright. So throughout all that time, the research hall and the orphanage are doing their thing, establishing the choir. They eventually discover the Great Eyes Chalice, which allows them to come into contact with Aritis, the daughter of the cosmos. So this does happen really late on the timeline, all things considered. And once they come into contact with her, they move her to the Grand Cathedral. And so from this point in the timeline, we have Jura being sad, we have Aritis just being sad and chilling before the main game starts. And so, with the Blood Moon being a thing, that could have been when Mensis got teleported into the Nightmare, which is why I have the Lecture Hall teleported. And from there, they might have started exploring like the Nightmare Frontier and potentially the Nightmare of Mensis as well. Although the Nightmare of Mensis might have really only come into being once the main game's events start. So like the night that the player comes to Yharnam. That being said, that's why I have the Mensis ritual here, because the Mensis ritual is occurring like as soon as the game begins. Like when you go out into Central Yharnam, everybody is pretty much already transformed, even though it isn't necessarily obvious. Like all of the little Yharnamite NPCs have really long left arms, or they've already transformed into full-on beasts. The brick trolls have tails and all those kind of things. So this is ongoing, and the player comes to Yharnam and gets administered blood. So the Blood Moon is summoned before we even wake up. But it's being hidden by Ram, which is like our impetus to go find out what's going on in Yharnam. So the people of Yharnam start transforming, and then we go out and try to figure out what the hell is going on for our quest, and then we'll eventually meet Gascoigne and proceed on through the rest of the game. As far as Ram goes, this is when we know for a fact she's actually like part of the game, so that's why I have Ram with a period here. So it's a mystery as to whether or not Ram was a thing during the time of Old Yharnam, or when she was really discovered. So that's a really big mystery with her overall. Okay, but that pretty much summarizes the timeline. I realize it's a really rough guide of events, but I think this might be the most comprehensive look at it that somebody's done, so I could be wrong about that. But I hope this resource will be useful to you guys. I'll leave a link to like an Imager version of this timeline so you guys can peruse it for yourself. I guess I could also make this spreadsheet that I made on Google Sheets public. But that'll be it for now. I hope you enjoyed this timeline. Thanks for watching if you have. Please consider liking and subscribing to the videos. And thank you to all the patrons and channel commenters. I appreciate it. And remember, fear the old lore. And Willem the Eye Rune. So this train right here is not very